Recently I did a video about my pick for the 10 best Nintendo 64 games. Well, technically 12. But here's the thing. Picking only that many games, or at least being limited to only that many games, is kind of stupid because what happens is that you miss out on talking about many other great ones that just weren't good enough to make the list, but are still great, so fuck it, let's look at some more. Rayman II. Naturally, this is a sequel to the classic 2D Rayman. Now this is a great game and I love the shit out of it, but there were two reasons I didn't put it on the list. First of all, this game has been ported to so many different consoles that it doesn't feel right to call it an N64 game anymore. I know some people might find that stupid, but hopefully you somewhat understand. Secondly, in comparison to all the other 3D platformers on the N64, this game always felt fairly linear to me. And while it's true that there are secrets hidden everywhere and sometimes multiple routes, the levels still adhere largely to a beginning, middle, and end formula and aren't as free roam as its counterparts. Still, very fun game, and chances are you own at least 3 of the devices on which you can play it. Tetrisphere. Now this game was omitted from the list because in the face of full-blown AAA platformers and adventure games and such, puzzle games seem quaint in comparison. But Tetrisphere isn't any ordinary puzzle game. What we're dealing with here is almost like playing Tetris on a giant sphere, hence the name. Basically, you're assigned a block to put down and you need to put it down on top of an identical piece that's connected to at least one other identical piece. But if you wait too long, it puts it down automatically, and if you're not on a compatible piece, that's 1 strike, and you get 3 and you're a dead man. The goal is to destroy the layers until you get to the core. Once enough of the core is exposed, you win. But that's not all, because if you do well enough, it starts giving you power-ups that you can use to just blow up the whole damn thing. It's awesome. And the sound effects are just amazing. Every time you destroy a bunch of pieces or blow something up, it just sounds incredible. And the soundtrack is just amazing for an N64 game. One thing you might hear about the N64 a lot is that the sound quality wasn't so great, but you would never know it from playing this game. It's incredibly addictive and the sound design is top notch. This might even be my favorite puzzle game of all time. Of course, nowadays puzzle games are largely considered shovelware and not real games, but this one gets my approval. Goldeneye and Perfect Dark are the 2 most iconic FPS games on the N64, and that's because the mechanics of the games were truly revolutionary. But sadly, these games have not stood the test of time. Since these games were released, the standard for FPS games has dramatically changed to the point that these games have become obsolete. If you play on original hardware, you're at the mercy of shit-eating frame rates and the N64's control stick. And in a game that requires you to shoot enemies with a certain degree of precision while their own bullets fly past your face, it's among the worst possible combinations of problems. Even if you play on an emulator, it still feels awkward. I wanted to put the games on the list out of respect for what they did to the genre, but I honestly just don't enjoy them enough. Well, not single player at least. See, despite all these issues I just mentioned, the multiplayer is still inexplicably fun. Somehow the multiplayer mode shines through all of the technical shortcomings, and that should be applauded. Then you got Tarak. There were a grand total of 4 Tarak games on the N64, and for all intents and purposes, it was a great series, but I'd say it suffers from a number of the same issues I mentioned for Goldeneye and Perfect Dark. Still, a number of people look back at these games fondly, while not in the same way as those 2. I honestly couldn't get into them, but I guess the power of nostalgia boners is ever more mighty. Speaking of nostalgia boners, another game I wanted to put on there was Earthworm Jim 3D. This was one of my favorite games as a kid, but most people don't seem to agree. Now from an objective point of view, I will say that I do understand where they're coming from. The camera's not so great and the boss battles can be really annoying. But when I play it, I see a great 3D platformer with decent controls and a great sense of humor. Not to mention hilarious voice acting provided by Dan Castellaneta. Other than that, it's got a great soundtrack. The graphics are a bit dusty even for '99, but other than that, I always like this one. If you keep an open mind, you might too. Now let's go back to FPS for a minute. As an FPS, Doom 64 is incredibly satisfying. Now compared to Goldeneye and Perfect Dark, this game appears very primitive, but that actually works in its favor. What it does is leave very little room for all the issues I mentioned in Perfect Dark and Goldeneye. The original Doom was being ported to every single platform they could put it on, but when it came to the N64, they decided to just make an original Doom game. This one has updated graphics and runs at a solid frame rate. The sound is great too, except that it lacks the awesome guitar music from the other games. What replaces it is a creepy ambience, which actually worked out pretty well. After all, I thought Doom was supposed to be a scary game to begin with anyway. This is possibly one of the best of the older Doom games. If nothing else, I fucking love it. Yoshi's Story, the exact opposite of Doom 64. In this game, you play as one of many different colored Yoshis as you run along a bright sunny world eating fruit so the Yoshis can become collectively happier. That's right, the entire game is a PSA to get kids to eat more fruit. It's stupid, but it has a certain appeal. It's even kind of fun. It's not groundbreaking or anything, the graphics are fairly simplistic, basically everything's made up of sprites pretending to be 3D, almost like Donkey Kong Country. But it looks okay and the music is nice. The only real complaint I have about it is the atmosphere. Most Mario games, or even spin-offs for that matter, may appeal to a generally younger audience, but in a way that doesn't alienate older audiences. But between the hand-stitched aesthetic and the nursery rhyme storybook subject matter, it almost seems like it was made specifically for kindergartners. And chances are it probably was. It's not half bad though. When most people think of Bomberman on the N64, most people think of Bomberman 64, naturally, but I always remembered Bomberman Hero. It's not a traditional Bomberman game, it's actually more of a platformer. Basically, you run and jump around the level throwing bombs at everything that's fragile and racking up points. At the end of each level, you get a rank based on how many points you have. It's got some pretty catchy music and the graphics are okay. Overall, it's a pretty decent game. The only real problem with it is that it's possibly one of the only Bomberman games that doesn't have multiplayer. Multiplayer in a Bomberman game is typically a given, so it's sacrilege that there isn't any. I briefly mentioned FZero X in the top 10 video. For those of you who don't know, FZero X is a racing game that, in contrast to Mario Kart and Diddy Kong Racing, is all about speed and how fast you're going, rather than using a bunch of crazy items and weapons. And goddamn do you go fast. You can top more than 1,000 kilometers per hour. Yeah, this game uses the metric system. But that's not all, because you can also ram into the other racers and blow them up. The game is a technical masterpiece too. The graphics aren't great, but there are actually 30 other racers in a match, all at once, and the game runs at 60 FPS. It's not because of the emulator either, it actually runs at 60 FPS on original hardware. It's very impressive. Now, I didn't feel right putting it on the list because I was never really good at it, and I didn't feel like I could give it the appreciation that it really warrants. At a time when Pokemon games were the absolute shit, I can only imagine how crazy people went over at Pokemon Stadium. Until this game came out, you would be doing all your Pokemon battles on a shitty little Game Boy screen, leaving a lot of the flair and substance to your imagination. Now imagine what it must have been like when you could finally see that shit in supercomputer N64 graphics on your television. That's pretty much the entire game, the ability to make Pokemon battles go down on the big screen. Well, at least a bigger screen than the Game Boy, but also in awesome 3D graphics. You could either choose from 151 Pokemon that come with the game, or you could even use the N64 transfer pack to load your own Pokemon from Pokemon Red and Blue, complete with all their stats. Now, I didn't consider this for the list because right now the concept is fairly underwhelming. The Pokemon battles are basically the entire game. There are some mini-games on the side, but they're not exactly groundbreaking. The entire game mostly seems like a tech demo that runs entirely on fan service. Now maybe that's what some people like, but not me. Alright, so you've all definitely heard of Smash Bros. In retrospect, this is the one game that I genuinely regret not putting on the original list. Basically in this game, you play as one of 12 Nintendo characters as you beat the ever-loving shit out of each other. You got Link stabbing Pikachu, you got Mario setting Fox on fire, it's utter chaos, but in a good way. As far as fighting games go, it's not really traditional, but that makes it very good for people who aren't really on top of the fighting game scene, and as such, it helps introduce the genre to those who feel alienated because of all the really technical and precise nature of other fighting games. It's so good that it ended up getting 3 sequels and will probably, or hopefully, get another one on the Switch. If they make that, plus another Earthbound game, I would buy a Switch like that. But we're getting off topic. Bottom line, this game is fantastic. Alright guys, the last game I want to talk about is Quest 64. This game is just incredible.